The question is, in reading a paper, do we have to read the entire paper or do we focus on specific elements? So, Matthew,
Mm.
how do we process a paper? How do we tackle that paper? What is the gold standard for how to read that paper?
Yeah, that's a great question and a super common one. Now, if we were all in residential PhD programs and this was all we were doing in our life, then I would say we're going to read every word of every paper. But most of us here in the grad coach environment are working professionals. We're adults with jobs and families and lives. And it just really isn't realistic to think I'm going to read every word of every paper and every journal in my field. So, how do we break that down? I think that's a great question. So, the first thing I always tell people to do is start with that abstract and read the abstract very carefully and ask yourself, does this abstract still resonate with my research topic and my research question? If it does not resonate, it goes in the maybe for later pile. So we're going to kind of prioritize which articles we're going to read. We don't want to spend time reading articles that are clearly not aligned to what we're trying to do at the moment. Don't delete those, just put them in a different folder. You might need them later, but we're prioritizing our work. The second thing we're going to do is it kind of depends on what part of our literature review we're working on. So if we're still in that essential theory building phase where we're trying to really understand what does the current literature say about our problem, then I'm going to start by reading their literature review. And it might not have a literature review heading, it might just say introduction, it might just dive right in. I'm going to read that section first because I'm still trying to wrap my head around the thinking and the conversations in this space. And so I'm going to read what other people have written about that first. And I might read 4 or 5 just literature review sections and then kind of put those papers in another folder for later to revisit once I get my head around the project. When I'm later in my literature review and I'm trying to make a case for maybe my study design, for my particular theory of action, I'm going to flip to the end of my study and I'm going to look at their methods to try to understand what did they do and what did they find. And I'm going to use that information to talk about why my study is relevant. I might also use that to help identify the gap in my study, because if I have a bunch of studies that are finding the same thing, but I have a different take or a different spin on it, that might help me justify the gap that I'm trying to fill with my dissertation. So always think about, what is the goal of my reading today? And I'm going to read the sections that match the goal of whatever that particular work session is. Never write a paper off, never throw a paper in the recycling bin. Keep them all neatly sorted. I also tell my clients to build out a spreadsheet where they can track what papers they've read, what day they read them, and kind of why they read them, what they found, so that you can always have those notes to go back to and you don't end up in sort of a madness cycle of rereading things that you've already looked at.
That's really great advice. And I think Matthew is right on the money there when it's really important to keep good notes while you're reading a paper. And as you mentioned earlier, it's all about having a catalog, a spreadsheet, whatever works for you. Some people also make use of their reference manager to track their notes as well. And so there are a range of tools that you can use, but the important thing is that you're consistent in their use. We actually have a few catalog examples that's accessible in our research toolkit. I'll put up the link for that a little later as well, so you can just take a look at those resources as well. And then really the other important thing to think about is when you are summarizing a paper for notes, you want to pull out the really key salient points. And what I always talk about doing is, what did the research set out to do? How did they do it? What did they find? What were the limitations of the study? And then what's the so what? How does that relate to my study? And if you're making notes on the paper, pulling out those key salient points is going to really help you to build up a nice, strong base of literature that you can work with as well.
Yeah, I would just also say, don't forget to look at the reference lists at the
Mm.
end of the research as you're reading it, because that can really help jumpstart and make sure that you are getting a thorough scan of the literature. So we kind of think about how much is enough. That's a question we get asked a lot. And the answer I like to give is, when you start to see the same people being cited in those references lists, that's when you've probably reached a critical mass for your field.